The council chamber aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion stretched wide enough to hold 1,000 warriors. But today only the most important ones filled its gleaming metal halls. Grand Admiral Thexnor stood at the center, his forearms crossed behind his back as holographic displays floated around him like captured stars. Each display showed a different world, a different conquest, a different species that had learned to kneel before the Zorkathi Empire. 300 years of perfect victories, 47 star systems, not a single defeat in living memory. Thexnor's scales gleamed purple under the chamber lights as he gestured toward the newest display. A small blue planet rotated slowly, white clouds swirling across its surface. Oceans covered most of it. The third planet from a yellow star the primitives called Sol. Earth, Thexnor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute confidence. Our scouts have watched them for 6 of their years. They are children playing with fire. The other admirals leaned forward, studying the data streams flowing beside the planet image. One of them, a younger officer named Kexel, raised a claw hesitantly. They have achieved nuclear fission, Grand Admiral. Doesn't protocol suggest caution with nuclear-capable species? Thexnor's laugh rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. Several other officers joined him. The sound echoed off the walls, bouncing back with the certainty of warriors who had never known defeat. Nuclear fission, Thexnor repeated as if the words themselves were a joke. We mastered fusion reactors before their planet cooled from its formation. They still burn chemical fuels to escape their own gravity well. Their fastest ships would take 40,000 years to reach the nearest star. He zoomed the display closer, showing clusters of lights across the night side of the planet. Look at them. Divided into hundreds of territories. They call them nations. They fight each other over invisible lines drawn on maps. Another admiral spoke up, her voice filled with the same casual contempt. The report says they've had 2 global wars in the last century alone. They nearly destroyed themselves with their own primitive weapons. These are not warriors. They are savages who happen to have discovered atoms. Thexnor nodded slowly, letting the words settle over the council. This was the Empire's strength, this certainty, this absolute knowledge that they stood at the peak of civilization, while others crawled in the valleys below. The Emperor wants their water, Thexnor continued. The planet is 70% ocean, mostly clean, mostly accessible. The strategic position of their system gives us a foothold in this spiral arm. Projections show minimal resistance. 3 days for complete pacification. 7 days for full resource extraction infrastructure. The holographic display changed, showing the invasion fleet that waited in high orbit around the Zorkathi homeworld. 300 warships, each one capable of reducing a city to glass from orbit. 50,000 warriors, trained since birth in the art of conquest. Weapons that could crack a planet's crust if needed. Kexel studied the numbers with a frown. Forgive my question, Grand Admiral, but isn't this force excessive? 300 ships for a pre-FTL civilization? We took the Kelvan homeworld with 70 ships, and they had particle beam defense grids. The Emperor wishes to send a message, Thexnor replied. Not just to Earth, but to any other primitives watching the stars. Resistance is futile. Surrender is the only logical choice. We will arrive in overwhelming force, demonstrate our superiority, and they will beg to serve. The council murmured its approval. This was the Zorkathi way. Shock and awe. Absolute dominance. In 3 centuries, it had never failed. Prepare the fleet, Thexnor commanded. We jump to their system in 6 hours. Send the standard message when we arrive. They have 72 hours to surrender their governments, 70% of their water resources, and accept vassal status under Imperial law. If they refuse, he paused, letting the silence stretch. We will demonstrate what happens to those who defy the Empire. The council saluted as one, forearms crossing over their chests in perfect synchronization. Within the hour, the fleet began its departure sequence. 300 warships vanished into the folded space of faster-than-light travel, heading toward a small blue planet that didn't yet know its fate had been decided. On Earth, Dr. Sarah Chen sat in her office at the Joint Deep Space Monitoring Facility in New Mexico, staring at data that shouldn't exist. She had been studying background radiation patterns in the Oort cloud when the readings went strange. Not wrong exactly, but unexpected. Gravitational distortions where there should be nothing but empty space and distant ice. She ran the analysis 3 times, checking her equipment, questioning her own eyes. The numbers didn't change. Something massive had just entered the outer edges of the solar system. multiple massive somethings moving together in a formation that nature could never create. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone. This was the call that everyone in her field had talked about in quiet voices, the one they had hoped would never come, the one that meant humanity was no longer alone, and the visitors weren't stopping to say hello. "Sir," she said when the director answered, "we have multiple contacts. Entering from the direction of Alpha Centauri. Speed is 0.3 light speed and holding steady. Vector is direct approach to Earth, sir. They're not slowing down." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then the director's voice came back, steady but tight with controlled tension. "How many contacts?" Sarah looked at her screen, at the cluster of gravitational signatures that painted a picture no one wanted to see. "Preliminary count is 287 distinct masses, sir. Size classification suggests capital ships. This is a fleet. This is an invasion force. Lock down the facility. Emergency protocols. I'm calling Washington." The line went dead. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, staring at the screen as the contacts moved steadily inward, cutting across the solar system like a knife aimed at Earth's heart. Around her, alarms began to sound. Red lights flashed in hallways. The facility that had spent decades listening to the stars in hope now scrambled with the knowledge that the stars had finally answered back. Within 2 hours, every major government on Earth knew the truth. Emergency sessions convened in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Brussels, Delhi, Brasilia. Military commanders pulled dusty folders from locked safes. Protocols that had been theoretical for decades suddenly became terrifyingly practical. The Zorkathi fleet continued its steady approach, confident and unstoppable. They had done this 47 times before. They knew how primitives reacted to superior force. Fear, panic, chaos, surrender. They expected nothing different from Earth. They had no idea how wrong they were. The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council began at 3 a.m, New York time. Representatives filed into the chamber with faces pale and drawn. Sleep-deprived aides carried tablets showing the same terrible data from dozens of different monitoring stations. The visitors were real. The threat was real. And they were getting closer with every passing hour. Secretary General Martinez stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "At 0400 hours UTC, we received a transmission from the approaching fleet. It has been translated and verified. I will play it now." The voice that filled the chamber was mechanical, filtered through translation software, but the message was crystal clear. "Primitive species of Sol 3. You are hereby claimed as property of the Zorkathi Empire. You will surrender all governmental authority, provide 70% of your planetary water resources, and accept classification as vassal servants. You have 72 hours to comply. Resistance will result in complete sterilization of your planet. This is your only warning," the chamber erupted. Ambassadors shouted in a dozen languages. Some demanded immediate military response. Others called for attempts at negotiation. A few simply sat in stunned silence, faces blank with shock. Martinez slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! We must maintain order!" But order was exactly what Earth appeared to be losing. Within hours, the transmission had leaked to the media. News networks broadcast the alien message in an endless loop. Cities descended into chaos as people fled population centers, clogged highways, emptied stores. Stock markets crashed worldwide. Religious leaders offered prayers while scientists offered calculations, none of them optimistic. The consensus was clear and terrible. Humanity had no defense against a spacefaring empire with 300 warships. In Moscow, the Kremlin was surrounded by protesters demanding the government do something, anything. In Beijing, similar crowds gathered in Tiananmen Square. London, Paris, Tokyo, Mumbai, São Paulo, every major city saw the same pattern. Panic spreading like wildfire. Governments scrambling for answers they didn't have. Or so it appeared. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a facility that officially didn't exist, a very different meeting was taking place. The room had no windows, no natural light, and no connection to any civilian communication network. 50 people sat around a table that could have hosted a corporate board meeting, except these people weren't discussing quarterly earnings. They were discussing survival. General James Morrison stood at the head of the table, his weathered face showing no emotion as he studied the faces around him. Chinese generals sat next to Russian commanders. European Union defense ministers shared data tablets with American Joint Chiefs. Rivalries that had defined geopolitics for decades meant nothing in this room. They never had. Status report, Morrison said simply. A woman in a Chinese military uniform stood. General Yao Lin, though her name appeared on no official roster. The Tiangong network is at full operational capacity. All orbital platforms are armed and tracking the approaching fleet. Estimated time to weapons range is 48 hours. A Russian officer went next. Chernobog system is online. All ground-based installations are synchronized with the orbital grid. We have full targeting solutions. One by one, they reported. The European Union's Odin Protocol, India's Kali Initiative, the African Union's Shaka Defense Network, South America's Pachamama Shield. Every major power and many smaller ones all reporting the same thing. Systems that shouldn't exist were operational and ready. Morrison nodded slowly, his face still showing no emotion. Then we proceed as planned. What's the status of the public misdirection? Proceeding perfectly, replied an American intelligence officer. All visible military movements are conventional forces. We've staged aircraft scrambles, missile repositioning. Exactly what a primitive species would do. Their sensors are reading exactly what we want them to read. And our actual assets? Invisible to their scans. The stealth field generators are working as designed. To their sensors, our orbital platforms look like communications satellites. The lunar installations read as mining equipment. Mars appears to be nothing but scientific outposts. The officer allowed himself a thin smile. They see what we want them to see. Morrison finally showed emotion, a grim satisfaction settling over his features. Gentlemen, ladies, we've been preparing for this day for 43 years. Since Roswell, we've known we weren't alone. Since the second crash in '97, we've known that not everyone out there would be friendly. Every secret project, every black budget program, every resource we've diverted from public view. It all comes down to the next 48 hours. He activated a display on the wall. It showed Earth from space, but overlaid with systems that no civilian knew existed. Orbital weapon platforms numbered in the thousands. Lunar facilities that could crack a moon. Martian installations that made the planet itself into a fortress. Asteroid belt mining operations that served a very different purpose than resource extraction. And everywhere, connecting it all, a quantum communication network that operated outside normal space-time. The Zorkathi think they're facing a divided primitive species, Morrison continued. They think our nuclear weapons are impressive. They think our chemical rockets represent the peak of our achievement. His voice hardened. They have no idea that while their empire spent 3 centuries conquering easy targets, we spent those same centuries fighting each other. We've perfected warfare across every domain. We've built weapons designed to defeat enemies just as creative and vicious as ourselves. A French admiral spoke up. What if they have weapons we haven't anticipated? Then we adapt, Morrison replied. That's what humans do. That's what makes us different from empires that haven't faced real resistance in living memory. We innovate. We improvise. We survive. He looked around the table at these representatives from nations that officially distrusted each other, competing with each other, sometimes hated each other. But here in this room they were simply human, unified by the only threat that mattered. The clock is ticking, Morrison said. 48 hours until they're in weapons range. The world above us thinks we're helpless. Let them think it. Let the Zorkathi think it. When they cross the threshold, when they move to attack, we show them what humanity has really built. The meeting continued through the night, coordinating systems across the globe and beyond. Outside, the world continued its apparent descent into chaos. News footage showed people praying, crying, saying goodbye to loved ones. Governments issued statements that ranged from defiant to resigned. It all looked exactly like a species facing inevitable doom. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, crossing the orbit of Jupiter, Grand Admiral Thexnor watched the same footage with satisfaction. His analysts provided constant updates on Earth's military movements. Primitive aircraft grouping into defensive formations, surface-to-air missiles being deployed, crude nuclear weapons being readied, though they'd never reach orbit before his fleet could intercept them. They're panicking, Kexil observed, watching a news feed showing people flooding out of New York City. This may be easier than projected. Thexnor nodded. They always panic. Fear is the universal constant. 3 more hours and we'll be in optimal strike position. We'll begin with a demonstration. Eliminate one of their cities from orbit. That usually speeds up the surrender process. He zoomed the display to show a tactical map of Earth, selecting targets, calculating firing solutions. Everything proceeding exactly as it had 47 times before. A perfect practiced routine of conquest. Neither he nor anyone else on the flagship noticed the small anomaly in their sensor data, a momentary gravitational flutter near the Martian orbit that their computers dismissed as cosmic background noise. They didn't see the quantum communications burst that had no electromagnetic signature. They didn't detect the zero-point energy reactors spinning up across the solar system, because those reactors operated on principles their science considered theoretical impossibilities. The Zorkathi were looking at Earth and seeing exactly what they expected to see. A primitive, frightened species with no real hope of resistance. They had 300 ships and 47 conquered systems worth of experience. What they didn't have was any experience facing an opponent who wanted them to feel confident. The Zorkathi fleet crossed the orbit of Mars in perfect formation. 300 warships moving like a school of predatory fish through the dark ocean of space. Grand Admiral Thexnor stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, watching the blue planet grow larger in his displays. 68 hours had passed since their ultimatum. The humans had not responded with words, only with the continued chaos of a dying civilization. Perfect. All ships report ready status, his tactical officer announced. Weapons systems are locked on primary targets. We await your command, Grand Admiral. Thexnor studied the tactical display with the practiced eye of a warrior who had seen this scenario dozens of times. Earth's primitive defenses were clustered around population centers, aircraft, missiles, the crude weapons of a species that had never fought beyond its own atmosphere. He almost felt pity for them. Almost. Open a channel, he commanded. Let me speak to them one final time. The communications officer worked his console, sending out a broad-spectrum signal that would reach every receiver on the planet below. Thexnor composed his features into what he hoped was a merciful expression. Humans of Earth, your time has expired. You have chosen silence over surrender. We will now demonstrate the cost of defiance. After we destroy one of your cities, you will have 1 additional hour to submit. Choose wisely. He cut the transmission and turned to his weapons officer. Target the city they call New York. Prepare firing solution. Grand Admiral. The sensor officer's voice cut through the bridge with an edge of confusion. I'm detecting spatial anomalies, multiple signatures appearing throughout our formation. Thexnor's attention snapped to the sensor display. Strange readings were blossoming like flowers across the screen, appearing between his ships around them, seemingly out of nowhere. Clarify. What am I looking at? Unknown, sir. The signatures don't match any FTL transit we've encountered. They're not moving through space, they're just appearing. Like they were always there and we couldn't see them. A cold finger of doubt touched Thexnor's spine. In 3 centuries, the Zorkathi had never encountered technology they couldn't understand. Visual confirmation, now. The main display shifted to show external camera feeds from multiple ships. What Thexnor saw made his blood run cold. Objects were materializing in the space around his fleet, resolving from invisibility into solid form. They were not ships in any traditional sense. They were geometric nightmares, angular, crystalline structures that hurt to look at, covered in systems that his tactical computer couldn't identify. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, appearing like ghosts becoming solid. Defensive formation, Thexnor roared. All ships, shields to maximum. Identify those. A transmission cut through his commands. A human face appeared on every screen on the bridge. Male, dark-skinned, wearing a uniform that looked almost primitive. But his eyes held no fear, only cold absolute certainty. Attention, Zorkathi fleet. You have violated the sovereign territory of the Sol system. You have threatened genocide against the people of Earth. You have 60 seconds to reverse course and begin retreat. This is your only warning. I am General James Morrison, Supreme Commander of the International Space Defense Force. The countdown begins now. Thexnor stared at the human face for 3 heartbeats of stunned silence. Then rage flooded through him. 60 seconds? You give us an ultimatum? Open fire. Destroy every human installation you can. Sir, we can't get a weapons lock. The platforms are interfering with our targeting systems. Every time we try to lock on Earth, we get ghost signals from. Then fire on the platforms. Destroy everything in range. The fleet's weapons lit up space with energy beams and kinetic projectiles. Thexnor watched with savage satisfaction as his ships poured devastating firepower into the geometric structures surrounding them. This was Zorkathi might, the power that had broken 47 worlds. The human platforms didn't move, didn't evade. They simply absorbed the incoming fire with shield systems that made the Zorkathi's best defenses look like tissue paper. Energy beams splashed against invisible barriers and dissipated. Kinetic rounds stopped in mid-flight and fell away like rain. And then the countdown reached 0. The human platforms didn't fire conventional weapons. What happened next was something that no Zorkathi sensor could properly track or record. Something that their scientists would spend years failing to understand. Space itself seemed to twist around individual ships. Microscopic gravitational anomalies appeared along hull lines, lasting for nanoseconds but long enough to matter. Where they appeared, shields failed. Hull plating didn't explode. It simply stopped existing. Molecular bonds severed by forces that operated at the quantum level. The warship Crimson Victory, which had participated in the conquest of 12 worlds, came apart in a cloud of expanding atoms. Its shields hadn't failed. They had simply become irrelevant against a weapon that didn't cross the space between attacker and target. The battlecruiser Eternal Wrath fired every weapon it had, pouring out enough firepower to glass a continent. A human platform appeared directly above it, so close that collision seemed inevitable. Instead, something emerged from the platform. Not a projectile, but a packet of information. Quantum entanglement at a scale that shouldn't be possible. The battlecruiser's own atoms were suddenly receiving instructions to become something else. Something very hot. Something that expanded very quickly. The ship detonated from within, not destroyed by external force, but convinced at the molecular level to become an explosion. Throughout the fleet, Zorkathi ships were simply ceasing to exist. The dreadnought Iron Fist, the carrier Starbreaker, the battleship Vengeful Tide. Ships that had survived dozens of campaigns, vessels that represented decades of construction and carried thousands of warriors, were being unmade in seconds. Thexnor watched his fleet die. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His tactical officer was screaming numbers that made no sense. 80 ships gone. 90, 100! Sir, we've lost a third of the fleet in less than 5 seconds. All ships, emergency FTL jump. Scatter pattern. Get us out of... FTL drives are being suppressed. We're locked in normal space. Another transmission from the human general, his voice calm as if he were discussing the weather. You're not leaving yet, Admiral. We're not finished with the demonstration. More platforms were appearing, these ones different, smaller, faster, moving like living things through the wreckage of the Zorkathi fleet. Thexnor's computer finally identified them, and he wished it hadn't. Autonomous hunter-killers with adaptive artificial intelligence. Not programmed responses, but actual learning machines that evolved their tactics in real time, studying Zorkathi weapons and defenses and finding weaknesses faster than his crews could adapt. A swarm of them descended on the carrier Skyfire. The ship's point defense systems fired frantically, destroying dozens of the small machines. But hundreds more kept coming, and each wave seemed to know exactly where the blind spots were, exactly when to dodge, exactly where to strike. They tore through the carrier's hull like metal insects, burrowing deep, finding critical systems. The carrier's reactor went critical. Another light winked out on Thexnor's display. 200 ships lost, his tactical officer reported, his voice hollow with shock. Fleet cohesion at critical levels. Admiral, we have to... The Eternal Dominion shuddered as something struck its shields. Not breached them, just struck them, testing them. A human platform had moved alongside, close enough that Thexnor could see details on its angular surface. Weapon ports were opening, systems were charging. The display showed energy readings that shouldn't be possible from something that size. Thexnor made a decision that no Zorkathi admiral had made in 300 years. All ships. Stop firing. Cease all hostile action. Broadcast on all frequencies. We surrender. We surrender! The human platform held its fire, weapon ports still glowing but not releasing their payload. Across the fleet, the surviving ships went silent, their weapons powering down. Thexnor looked at his display. 300 ships had entered this system. 240 were gone, erased in 4.3 seconds of actual combat. The remaining 60 were damaged, shields failing, crews in shock. General Morrison's face appeared again. This time, Thexnor saw something in the human's expression that was worse than anger. It was disappointment, as if the Zorkathi had failed some test they didn't know they were taking. 60 ships remain, Morrison said. We're going to let some of you leave. Not out of mercy. Out of necessity. Someone needs to deliver a message. Thexnor wanted to scream defiance, to rage against this impossible defeat. But he was a warrior and he recognized when he had lost. More importantly, he recognized that he had lost to an enemy he had catastrophically underestimated. The worst kind of defeat. We will deliver your message, he said, the words like poison in his throat. Morrison nodded slowly. Good, then listen carefully, Admiral. Because your Empire's survival depends on you getting this exactly right. The bridge of the Eternal Dominion was silent except for the quiet beeping of damaged systems and the ragged breathing of shocked crew members. Grand Admiral Thexnor stood before the display showing General Morrison's face, trying to maintain some dignity, even as his entire understanding of the universe crumbled around him. Morrison gestured and the display split. One half continued showing his face. The other half began showing something else. Data streams, historical footage, technical specifications. It was like watching someone open a door into a room you never knew existed. Let me show you what you missed, Admiral, Morrison said, his tone almost gentle, like a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a struggling student. Let me show you what you were actually facing. The display showed Earth from orbit but overlaid with markers that Thexnor's sensors had never detected. Thousands of weapon platforms that had been invisible to Zorkathi scanning technology. The moon wasn't a natural satellite. It was a fortress, its interior hollowed out and converted into the largest military installation in the Sol system. Mars was similar, an entire planet transformed into a defensive position. Your scouts observed us for 6 years, Morrison continued. They saw our radio telescopes and missed the gravitational wave communication networks operating in dimensions you haven't discovered yet. They saw our chemical rockets and missed the quantum displacement drives we've been testing on the far side of Jupiter. They saw divided nations and missed the unified military command structure we established in 1982. Thexnor's translator struggled with some of the terms. Quantum displacement, dimensional operations, concepts his science considered impossible. You're not a primitive species, he managed to say. The timeline doesn't make sense. 6 years ago, you were barely into your own solar system. 6 years ago is when your scouts arrived, Morrison agreed. But our preparation didn't begin 6 years ago. It began much earlier. The display changed, showing grainy footage of a desert landscape, a crashed vehicle of some kind, clearly not human in origin. The date stamp read 1947. 78 years ago, we received our first visitor, a scout ship from a species we later learned were refugees, running from something they wouldn't discuss. They died in the crash, but their technology survived. It took us decades to understand even the basic principles, but we learned something important. We weren't alone in the universe, and space wasn't empty. More footage flowed across the display. Secret facilities, underground laboratories, test flights of vehicles that looked nothing like the rockets the Zorkathi scouts had observed. Morrison's narration continued, calm and methodical. We had a choice to make. We could continue fighting each other over resources and territory on one planet, or we could prepare for the day when someone came from outside. Someone who might not be friendly. It wasn't an easy choice. Nations that had fought wars for centuries had to learn to work together in secret. Resources had to be diverted from public view. We had to develop weapons without anyone knowing we were doing it. The display showed a montage of human history, wars, terrible, destructive conflicts spanning millennia, weapons evolving from stone to steel to explosives to nuclear fire, each conflict more devastating than the last, each one teaching humanity new ways to kill. You've conquered 47 systems in 300 years, Morrison said. Impressive. But here's what you don't understand about humans, Admiral. We've been conquering each other for 10,000 years. We've fought wars across every domain, land, sea, air, and eventually space. We've built weapons specifically designed to defeat enemies who are just as creative, just as desperate, and just as vicious as we are. Thexnor watched footage of human conflicts, massive armies clashing, cities burning, weapons that horrified him in their simple brutality. These weren't the tools of a primitive species. They were the refinements of a species that had perfected the art of warfare through constant, brutal practice. Your empire expanded by defeating species that had never faced real resistance, Morrison continued. You developed tactics that worked against weak opponents and never needed to improve them. You built weapons that were good enough and never needed to make them better. You grew confident, comfortable. The display showed Zorkathi battles from their own records, footage the humans should never have been able to access. Thexnor's shock deepened. They had hacked Zorkathi systems. They had been inside his fleet's computers, watching, studying. We, on the other hand, have never had the luxury of weak opponents. Every major war pushed us to innovate or die. Every conflict was against enemies who learned and adapted. We didn't just develop weapons, Admiral. We developed the ability to outthink, outplan, and out-innovate anyone who threatened us. The display showed the human platforms again, those geometric nightmares that had torn through his fleet like it was made of paper. Morrison pointed to them with something that might have been pride. Gravitational shear weapons, quantum entanglement warheads, adaptive AI hunter-killers, dimensional suppression fields. We didn't copy these from anyone. We invented them by asking a simple question. How do you kill someone who has shields that stop conventional weapons? Someone who uses tactics that worked for 3 centuries? You figure out what they can't defend against and you build weapons they've never imagined. Thexnor found his voice, though it came out weaker than he would have liked. Why reveal this? Why tell me any of this? Morrison's expression hardened. Because you need to deliver a message to your Emperor, and to any other species watching, and to anyone else who might be considering what you attempted today. The display zoomed out, showing the Sol system in tactical overview. Every defensive position, every weapon platform, every military installation that humanity had built over decades of secret preparation. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It represented a level of coordinated effort that the Zorkathi, despite their empire, had never achieved. Here's the message, Admiral. Earth is not helpless. Earth is not primitive. Earth is not available for conquest. We've been waiting for someone like you. We've been ready. And now you're going to go home and tell your Emperor exactly what happens when you threaten humanity. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes locked on Thexnor's. We've already mapped your empire. We know where your shipyards are. We know where your colony worlds are located. We know where your Emperor sleeps at night. We've had ships in your territory for 3 years, watching you the same way you watched us. The difference is you never saw ours. It was impossible. The Zorkathi home system had defensive sensors that could detect a ship the size of a fighter from 3 light years away. You're lying, Thexnor said, but his voice held no conviction. Morrison smiled without humor and gestured. The display showed footage from what was clearly the Zorkathi capital. Street scenes, government buildings, the Imperial Palace itself. Timestamps showed the footage was recent. Some of it was from yesterday. We're not lying, Admiral. We're not bluffing. We're teaching. This is what happens when you underestimate your opponent. This is what happens when you let 3 centuries of easy victories make you arrogant. This is what happens when you threaten a species that has spent its entire existence learning how to fight. Thexnor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Real, genuine fear. Not fear of death in battle, that was honorable. Fear of having made a mistake so catastrophic that it might doom his entire species. What do you want from us? He asked. Nothing, Morrison replied. We don't want your territory. We don't want your resources. We don't want to conquer you. We just want you to leave us alone. And we want everyone else who might be watching to understand that Sul is now a defended system. The next fleet that approaches with hostile intent won't get a warning. It won't get a chance to surrender. It will be detected and destroyed before it even enters the Oort cloud. Morrison stood and his image grew larger on the display. 30 of your ships will be permitted to jump to FTL and return to your empire. The other 30 will remain here, held in place by our gravitational anchors, not destroyed. Kept alive as further demonstration of our capabilities. In 1 month, we'll release them. Consider them hostages to your good behavior. And if we return with a larger fleet? Thexnor asked, though he already knew the answer would destroy the last of his hope. Then we'll introduce you to weapons we didn't use today, Morrison said simply. What you saw was defensive capability, Admiral. Things we built to protect our home. If you make us go on offense, if you make us come to your territory instead of defending our own, you'll learn what happens when humans stop trying to minimize casualties and start trying to end threats permanently. I suggest you don't find out what that looks like. The transmission ended. Thexnor stood in the silence of his ruined bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of the most powerful fleet the Zorkathi Empire had ever assembled. A fleet that had been reduced to 60 damaged ships by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. He looked at the surviving members of his crew, young warriors who had expected an easy victory and instead witnessed the impossible, veterans who had served in dozens of campaigns and never seen anything like this, all of them looking to him for orders, for leadership. 3 months had passed since the fleet returned home. Grand Admiral Thexnor stood in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, a place he had stood many times before to report victories. Today was different. Today, he stood as the bearer of the Empire's first defeat in 300 years, and the weight of that failure sat on his shoulders like gravity from a dying star. The Emperor sat on his throne, ancient and massive, his scales showing the gold patterns that marked pure royal bloodline. Around the throne room, the High Council waited in silence. Every important figure in the Zorkathi Empire was present. They all knew what had happened. They had all seen the recordings. But hearing it from Thexnor's own mouth made it real in a way that reports and footage could not. "Speak," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Thexnor squared his shoulders and began his report. He spoke for an hour, detailing every aspect of the failed invasion. The human weapons that operated on principles Zorkathi science could barely understand. The unified defense grid that had been hidden in plain sight. The speed and precision of the counterattack that had erased 240 ships in seconds. The technological superiority that should not have existed in a species that appeared primitive. When he finished, silence hung over the throne room like smoke after a fire. Finally, one of the council members spoke, a war minister who had overseen dozens of successful campaigns. "This is impossible. A species cannot advance that quickly. Our scouts observed them thoroughly. Their technology level was confirmed." "Our scouts observed what the humans wanted them to observe," Thexnor replied. "We measured their visible technology and assumed it represented their full capability. We were wrong. Catastrophically wrong." Another council member stood, her voice sharp with accusation. "You commanded the largest fleet ever assembled. You had every advantage. How could you lose to primitives?" "They were never primitive," Thexnor said, and now anger crept into his voice. "That was our mistake. We assumed that visible technology indicated overall capability. We assumed that divided political systems meant divided military capacity. We assumed that lack of faster-than-light travel meant inferiority. Every assumption was wrong." He activated a holographic display showing footage from the battle. The council watched in growing horror as human weapons unmade Zorkathi ships with casual efficiency. They watched adaptive AI systems learn and evolve faster than military computers could calculate responses. They watched weapons that operated outside normal spacetime, making traditional defenses meaningless. "The humans have been preparing for first contact for nearly 80 years, Thexnor continued. "While we grew comfortable with easy conquests, they were innovating. While we used the same tactics for 3 centuries, they were developing new ones. They are not primitive, counselors. They are dangerous in ways we never imagined." The Emperor raised one massive hand, silencing the murmuring that had started among the council. "The 30 ships you left behind. What is their status?" "Released 2 weeks ago, as the humans promised." They returned with a formal message. Thexnor gestured, and another hologram appeared. General Morrison's face recorded but no less intimidating for it. The council listened to Earth's terms. The Sol system was sovereign territory. Military approaches would be considered acts of war. Trade and diplomatic contact were possible, under human terms and conditions. "They dictate terms to us?" A council member sputtered. "To the Zorkathi Empire? They demonstrated the capability to destroy our fleet and chose not to," Thexnor replied flatly. "They demonstrated the capability to reach our home world undetected and chose not to attack. They are not dictating from a position of bluster, counselor. They are dictating from a position of demonstrated superiority." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying the holographic display. Finally he spoke. "Our subject species. What is their status?" The intelligence minister stood, his report clearly painful to deliver. "The news of our defeat has spread throughout the Empire. The Kelvan have declared independence. The Morgath colonies have ceased tribute shipments. The Yenth are in open rebellion. We calculate that within 6 months 15 systems will attempt to break away from Imperial control." The throne room erupted in angry shouts. 3 centuries of expansion, unraveling because of one defeat. The Emperor let them shout for a moment, then silenced them with a gesture. And the humans? Have they made contact with our former subjects? No, Majesty. Their ships have been observed at our borders, but they have made no aggressive moves. They appear to be watching, observing, exactly as we once observed them. The Emperor leaned back on his throne, and something like a bitter smile crossed his features. They learned from us. How unfortunate that the lesson worked both ways. He looked at Thexnor. Admiral, your honest assessment. If we gathered every ship in the Empire and returned to Earth, what would be the outcome? Thexnor met his Emperor's eyes without flinching. Total defeat, Majesty. The weapons they used against us were defensive systems. General Morrison made it clear they have offensive capabilities they did not deploy. If we force them to take aggressive action, if we make them come to us rather than defending their own territory, the Empire will fall. Not gradually, quickly. The Emperor nodded slowly. Then we have one choice. We sue for peace. We open diplomatic channels. We treat with them as equals. The words clearly tasted like poison in his mouth, but he spoke them anyway, because the alternative is extinction. Far across the galaxy in countless systems, other civilizations were reaching similar conclusions. The footage from the battle at Earth had spread through black markets and intelligence networks. Advanced species that had been considering expansion into the Sol region suddenly reconsidered. Younger civilizations looked at humanity with new respect and fear. The political landscape of an entire galactic sector had shifted overnight. On Earth, in the public spaces where normal people lived and worked, life was slowly returning to something like normal. The revelation of the secret space military had caused uproar, investigations, and endless debates. Politicians navigated the scandal carefully. Yes, they had diverted resources. Yes, they had kept secrets. But those secrets had saved humanity from enslavement. The public was angry but alive, and gradually that seemed like a reasonable trade. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in her office at the Joint Deep Space Monitoring Facility, looking at displays that were now much more sophisticated than the ones she had used 3 months ago. There was no need to hide the advanced equipment anymore. Earth's technology was public knowledge now, at least the basic facts of it. They had weapons. They had ships. They had capabilities that matched or exceeded most spacefaring civilizations. She watched the new monitoring stations come online. These ones humanity didn't bother hiding. Massive installations at the Lagrange points. Orbital platforms that openly bristled with weapon systems. The Sol system's defense grid, once secret, now stood as an open warning to anyone watching. Her console chimed. Multiple contacts, approaching from the direction of the Zorkathi Empire. She tensed for a moment, then relaxed as the identification codes came through. Diplomatic vessels broadcasting peaceful intentions, requesting permission to approach Earth. General Morrison stood in the command center of what was now called the International Space Defense Force headquarters, no longer buried under a mountain but standing openly in Geneva. The facility was a symbol of Earth's new position in the galaxy. Transparent walls showed the sky above, and holographic displays showed the space beyond. Nothing hidden, nothing apologetic. He watched the diplomatic vessels approach and allowed himself a small smile. The galaxy was learning to knock before entering. That was progress. He opened a communication channel, his face appearing on screens across the facility. This is General Morrison to all stations. We have incoming diplomatic contact. Prepare for standard greeting protocols. Maintain defensive readiness, but do not show aggression. Let's show our visitors that humans can be gracious hosts, as long as guests remember their manners. Outside Earth's atmosphere, construction continued on humanity's first interstellar shipyard. The massive structure orbited Venus, growing larger every day. Automated systems assembled components while human engineers supervised. The ships being built there weren't for invasion or conquest. They were for exploration, for trade, for defense of human interest in a galaxy that was suddenly much more crowded. But they were also a message. A visible, undeniable statement that Earth wasn't just defending anymore. The species that had nearly been enslaved was building a fleet. Not to match the great empires, but to exceed them. Not to conquer others, but to ensure no one could conquer them. In the final analysis, humanity had learned the most important lesson from their brush with extinction. The galaxy respected strength. Not aggression, but capability. The ability to defend what was yours. The willingness to innovate, adapt, and survive no matter what came through the dark. Earth still had problems. Nations still competed. Resources were still scarce in places. But now those problems had context. They were human problems to be solved by humans, without interference from empires that thought water and strategic position gave them ownership rights.